form a union like we did with our 13 states when we created the United States. They did it, and each state was independently separated, but in a joint group in the war. And after the war, if the South had won, the bankers would have created a central bank in Georgia, and one in Florida, and one in North Carolina, and one everywhere else. There'd be 11 of them. And then they would start wars like they do in Europe. Georgia would fight South Carolina, and then there'd be a war, and they borrow the money through the central banks. And then now North Carolina would fight South Carolina. And so there was a strategy to get us into the central banking issue. And Lincoln said, no, we're not going to do it. And, of course, they won. Now, there's an interesting reason that the North won the war, because the South did not have any ability. Primarily it was agricultural. They didn't have the ability to make rifles and guns and cannons and bullets and develop that material to fight a major war. So they were getting their supplies from England and France. Now, England and France are our allies. Well, we thought they were, except in the Civil War. They were funding the South, supplying them with the cannon and the rifles and the bullets and wherever they needed to fight the war. So Lincoln realized that the way to win a war was to blockade the South. He knew they were shipping goods from over a 3,000-mile ocean called the Atlantic, and so they thought, we blockade the ports, and therefore the stuff would dry up and the war would be over. So they started creating, what they call is the word for it, blockade runners. Very wealthy individuals said, I'll bring the goods in at twice the price and make a profit, because once in a while one of my ships might not get through. So Lincoln said that's not satisfactory, so he looked around to find someone to help him, and there was only one nation in Europe without a central bank. Central banks are not government, they're privately owned. You don't even know who owned them, but the central banks run the various nations. And when it's time for war, they plan it and then force the government into it and make them borrow it. So Lincoln looked around and found only one nation without a central bank, and that was Russia. And Russia had, at the same time, the largest navy in the world. So he worked out a deal with Seward, our Secretary of State, to have them send their navy to not only the West Coast, but the East Coast, especially the East Coast, because that's where the war was. They were getting it from England and France. But they came over and they docked, and then they were read, the admirals from the Russian Navy read the letters and the notes to the sailors, that whenever you see a ship that looks like it's going to board, we're going to try to land it and unload, you can stop it, and if it's got goods on it that's going to south, you stop it, and if you have to, you can have the permission to sink it. So once that happened, England and France decided to get out of the war in 1863. The war started in 1861. This was 2 years or approximately years later when the ships showed up on both the east and the west coast, and they were welcomed. In fact, the city of Baltimore, I got a copy of it, I put it in my book, a copy of a resolution they passed welcoming the ships from Russia, because they said, of all the nations in Europe, the ones that were more closely attuned to was England and France, but they're supplying the South. So that was rather strange that Russia would assist us. Well, they did. And that started the blockade, and England and France canceled the orders for big blockade-running ships, and the South was on its own, basically, and that's why the American government actually won the war. Now, go ahead.
The reason I just want to interject really quickly, and I'll let you finish the story. But the reason that I just wanted to bring up, the reason why I brought it up, because it's interesting that prior to what I call germ warfare or the COVID-19, we had what was the BLM, and which is no disrespect to the Black community and the Native American communities. It's been a horrible plight throughout history. However, there was that same sort of agitation was used across the nation to, attack small businesses in poorer communities. And it really caused a lot of division and strife amongst the people.
Yes.
And similar in a similar fashion, if you will. And I just thought that was interesting.
Well, we could talk about that if you wish. It's not the Civil War, but it's a civil war in America because Americans are fighting Americans. But notice this. The group is called Black Lives Matter, but there's only about, I think, 10 or 12 people being shot by the police in America per year. And yet the Black Lives don't matter in Chicago or Detroit. In Chicago, they're killing 10 to 12 a weekend. Black lives, blacks fighting blacks, but the Black Lives don't matter in Chicago or Detroit or Baltimore or these major cities, which is very strange, isn't it? So there's something going on. And what's going on is they're going to try to change our civilization to the New World Order. That was my second book. And that's something we could discuss at another time, maybe, to get into that issue about what it is. What this is all about.
It's the infiltration of the trauma of causing the hatred within the sowing seeds of hatred, with pitting Americans against Americans. It's that. And then it's the trauma. It's almost the mind programming, if you will, of re-enslaving the new generation currently in a much similar fashion. And I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, that's very real. In fact, this is a revolution. Well, maybe you want to get into that, but it's a duplicate of the one that happened in Russia. In 1917, the very wealthy, primarily large capitalists, meaning they own factories, hired Lenin and paid him to start a revolution, just like Black Lives Matter and Antifa are both being funded by large corporations here in America. I've been told, I've never checked it, but I've been told if you go to Black Lives Matter, their website, they'll tell you where they're getting money from, and it's large American corporations. Now, wait a minute. Why are they doing that? Well, they're hoping that once the Black Lives Matter succeed and we have a revolution, they'll be the only ones selling any goods in America. Yeah, so that's what it's all about.
And all of the major corporations will be the businesses.
Yes.
That are open and operating. So what culminated to what actually occurred building up to the assassination of Lincoln during that time?
Yes. Okay. Let's go back. The group was called the Knights of the Golden Circle, and they were created by primarily by European wealthy to come here to spread secession amongst the blacks, black and the North as well. And so they did, and the goal was to get Lincoln to borrow money from a central bank that they would create, or they would loan the money to, and as I said, they didn't do it. But anyway, they were fighting a big war, and the Knights of the Golden Circle were Southerners and even some Northerners. And when Lincoln finally won the war, By the way, just yesterday I was watching a lady with a microphone down in Miami, I guess during, what's it called, spring break or something, asking kids, who won the Civil War? Oh, France did. No, Germany. Or was it Brazil? They have no idea. So I know the North won. And then they, as a way of punishing Lincoln, the Knights of the Golden Circle hired John Wilkes Booth, who was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, to assassinate him. And he succeeded. And then William Stanton, who was Secretary of War, was in town, Washington, D.C., was there when Lincoln was assassinated. And as soon as he heard that, he was in charge of still the war. It just ended about a week or so before. And so he blockaded, there were 8 roads leading out of Washington, D.C., and only one of them could get you to the south. It was called the Navy Yard Bridge. It was a pontoon bridge built across, I guess, some river, and once you got there, I think you got into Maryland, and then you could get into Virginia, which I think was a southern state. And so he issued orders for 7 of the 8 roads to be blockaded, but not number 8, and John Wilkes Booth crossed the river, and then allegedly was shot in the barn, as we've all been taught, and unfortunately, John Wilkes Booth was not shot in the barn. Stanton got a southern captain in a prison in the south, and brought him up, and had him go to the barn, because he looked a great deal like John Wilkes Booth himself, similar size, similar looking, a similar hairdo, similar beard, etc. And so he put him in the barn, and then he instructed a sergeant to kill Booth. Inside the barn, they drug him out, and before anybody could even get a close look at him, Stanton picked the body up, and took it to a ship. I think it was I can't remember the name of it. Took it out to Montauk. Took it out in the river where no one could get to it, and they did an autopsy, and he certified that the body was that of John Wilkes Booth, and it was not. It was the body of James William Boyd, same initials, JWB, who was a Southern captain. So now Booth was allowed to survive. Well, the Knights of the Golden Circle kept paying him $300 a month to keep silent, because they didn't want to let him admit that he survived, and that there was a conspiracy that made sure he survived, Stanton and others. So they kept paying him, but unfortunately he started to have thoughts, and I'm sure most people would, because he was a young man when he shot him, and as he was maturing, he started to realize what he had done, and he was apparently trying to I guess, clear his conscience in admitting that he was really the real John Wilkes Booth. Some people believed him, some didn't, and thought he was a madman, but he was an alcoholic. But the thing that's of interest that I really looked into was the man who poisoned him. He found him in 1903 in, I think it was Enid, Enid, Oklahoma, in a boarding house. And he went to them, the man and one other fellow, 2 of them, went to go visit one night and found him pretty well drunk. And they got him to drink. Oh, first of all, the leader of the 2 was the head of the Knights of the Golden Circle in 1903. It was still in existence, but surely not doing anything. But they were, I'll talk about that in a minute, they were wealthy enough to pay him $3 a month just to keep silent, and he was no longer keeping silent, so they had to silence him. So this is not very pleasant. They put arsenic in 2 glasses, and Booth drank it, and then perished, died. Now, so that ends that story, but it didn't end it. A couple, 3, 4 days later, the guy that had the rooming house hadn't seen him and went up and banged on the door, and there was no answer. He hadn't seen him come in or go out for a day or 2 or 3. So he opened the door, and he found, I'm sorry, this is kind of funny, but the details are what's interesting. He found him embalmed by the arsenic. So he arranged to sell the body of John Wilkes Booth to a traveling road show, and people would pay 25 cents to see John Wilkes Booth, and they would walk into I guess covered probably somehow with glass maybe. You could look down into the coffin and see the body of John